Poetry, like any other art form, is a product of society and its seismic forces, and as such, it's seen its fair share of paradigms. An understanding of these shifts can provide valuable context and vastly enhance the experience of reading poetry, especially if you have academic proclivities. And what better day to do that than World Poetry Day? I've come to realize in my limited time and experience that movements in poetry typically emerged in response to excesses of a previous style or societal conviction. Romanticism emerged in the 1800s and followed the Enlightenment era, a phase of sustained and tectonic intellectual discourse and reasoning. Where there was magic, there was science, and where there was curiosity, there was reasoning. And sometimes the more explanation you find for something beautiful, the less beautiful it starts to look. And perhaps that is why Romantic era poetry seems to be driven by an urge to be spontaneous, wild, and most importantly, organic. Poetry of this era is distinctly characterized by the unrestrained outpouring of feelings and visual imagery of the natural world that is ornate, bordering insane. In William Wordsworth's preface to his publication in 1800 titled Lyrical Ballads, he wrote at length about the primary muses and the intent behind the styles adopted. On why rural life assumed importance, Wordsworth wrote, "Low and rustic forms of life was generally chosen because in that situation the essential passions of the heart find a better soil in which they can attain their maturity, and lastly because in that situation the passions of men are incorporated with the beautiful and permanent forms of nature." On the causes behind the human mind being reduced to a state of almost savage torpor, he wrote, "The increasing accumulation of men in cities where the uniformity of their occupations produces a craving for extraordinary incident which the rapid communication of intelligence hourly gratifies." On poetry itself, and this is an oft-repeated quote, poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. It takes its origin from emotion recollected in tranquility. The emotion is contemplated till by a species of reaction that the tranquility gradually disappears and an emotion similar to that which was before the subject of contemplation is gradually produced and does itself actually exist in the mind. In this mood, successful composition generally begins, and in a mood similar to this, it is carried on. Emphasis was placed on the selection of ordinary incidents and the use of ordinary language, and that somehow led to extraordinary poetry. Wordsworth, for instance, believed this to be necessary even at the expense of radically diverging from the customary purpose of poetry. He wrote, "Because from their rank in society and the sameness and narrow circle of their intercourse, being less under the action of social vanity, they convey their feelings and notions in simple and unelaborated expressions. Accordingly, such a language arising out of repeated experience and regular feelings is a more permanent and far more philosophical language than that which is frequently substituted for it by poets." And that brought poetry to the masses. Romantic era poems could be utterly frivolous or profoundly philosophical, surprisingly short or meanderingly long, create unfettered joy or endless brooding, and in all of that, I suppose they captured the length and breadth of being human. The poems of William Wordsworth, John Keats, Percy Bysshe Shelley, and William Blake are synonymous with Romanticism, and you can explore a part of their work in the Verse Wall series titled A Summer Romance. Essential reading includes Daffodils by Wordsworth, where you can dance with sparkling blue lakes and, well, daffodils. To Autumn by Keats, where the season is personified as a disarmingly attractive young maiden. The Cloud by Shelley, where I'm inclined to believe that if you focus enough, you can actually feel like you're flying away on one. And The Tiger by Blake, where the tiger is rendered a primal ferocity that will make you, the reader, shake in your boots. The Victorian era lasted the length of the reign of Queen Victoria and belonged to the likes of the Bronte sisters and Oscar Wilde, and within poetry to Robert Browning, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, Alfred Lord Tennyson, and Matthew Arnold. As a broader cultural movement, it supposedly made Britain the cultural capital of the English-speaking world. Further to how Romantic era poems sought to appeal to the masses, and coupled with advancements in publishing, poetry in the Victorian age reached new levels of popularity and commercial importance. Poetry Foundation's essay on Victorian poetry opens with a wonderful line for us to build upon. Victorian poetry's most distinctive qualities may stem, paradoxically, from its proximity to other genres and forms. theatre, fiction, music, and art, all of them poetry's competitors in a fully stocked cultural marketplace. When read with this quote of John Stuart Mill, poetry is feeling, confessing itself to itself in moments of solitude. All poetry is of the nature of soliloquy. We are offered an early insight into the motivations for the movement's single biggest product, the form of the dramatic monologue, popularized by Robert Browning. Poems like My Last Duchess and The Patriot are vivid and dark explorations of the inner psyche in potentially superfluous language. Proximity to fiction is also demonstrated elsewhere. Alfred Lord Tennyson's eminent The Lady of Shalott was built on Arthurian subject matter. Although it would be unreasonable to assume a cultural movement spread its wings across the world in the 19th century when communication was restricted to pen, ink, and print, American contemporary Edgar Allan Poe's poetry, specifically Annabel Lee, Conqueror Worm, and The Raven, are inextricably tied to fiction, whims, and fancies. As a style, even though it remained verbose and elaborate, Victorian poetry moved a little away from irrational exuberance or melancholy demonstrated in Romantic era poetry and veered sharply into more artistic pursuits. The most literal testament to this shift is the work of visually minded poets like Dante Gabriel Rossetti. I'm particularly fond of this extract from Poetry Foundation's essay. Art for Art's Sake, an English translation of the French motto, crystallized the late 19th century doctrine of aestheticism, which swerved away from nihilistic despair over life's meaninglessness by wagering everything on the meanings made within art. Death and darkness also began to feature outside of brooding and mourning, and perhaps disturbingly also as a muse. Porphyria's Lover by Robert Browning, for instance, narrates a pastoral romance ruined by intrusive thoughts. For the feral feminists in the audience, what made the Victorian era even more special was the emergence of women in poetry. Elizabeth Barrett Browning came agonizingly close to recognition as Poet Laureate, a title first granted in England in the 17th century for poetic excellence, whose holder is a salaried member of the royal household, while Christina Rossetti staked her claim to be remembered as the best woman poet of the era through her unfailingly devout religious poetry. The Verse Vault will soon conclude a 10-poem series on Victorian poetry, a series that's elaborate enough to stay true to its subject matter, and these are some highly recommended poems. The Lady of Shalott by Tennyson, where a woman cursed to weave tapestries forever dies on seeing a knight. My Last Duchess by Robert Browning, where a duke that murdered his genial wife puts up a portrait of her behind the curtain. Dover Beach by Matthew Arnold, where there's an intense existentialist crisis triggered by the creation versus evolution debate. And My Heart and I by Elizabeth Barrett Browning, which is not a popular piece of work, but is excellent salve for the broken heart nonetheless. Much like how Romanticism evolved as a direct compensatory consequence of an epoch of rationality and reasoning, the Imagist movement was something of a retort to the verbose body of work left behind by the Romantic and Victorian era poets. Born in the earlier 20th century, it heralded the modernist revolution in poetry and is remembered by the poems of Ezra Pound, William Carlos Williams, T.H. Hume, Hilda Doolittle, or HD as she liked to be known, and Nobel laureate T.S. Eliot. Imagism was built on being precise, on the art of finding the exact words and not using one more than what was strictly necessary. The foundational principles were established in Ezra Pound's essay, A Retrospect. Direct treatment of the thing, whether subjective or objective, to use absolutely no word that does not contribute to the presentation, as regarding rhythm, to compose in the sequence of the musical phrase, not in sequence of a metronome. All of these tenets found their origin in Pound's criticism of different aspects of poetry as it existed then, and sought to precisely define poetry as an art form in its own and what it must strive for. On the excess of language, for instance, Pound scathingly remarked, "Indeed, vers libre has become as prolix and as verbose as any of the flaccid varieties that preceded it. It has brought faults of its own. The actual language and phrasing is often as bad as that of our elders, without even the excuse that the words are shoveled in to fill a metric pattern or to complete the noise of a rhyme sound." On the necessity to keep poetry independently purposeful, Pound recommended, "Don't be viewy, leave that to the writers of pretty little philosophical essays. Don't be descriptive, remember that the painter can describe a landscape much better than you can, and that he has to know a deal more about it." On the importance of musicality in poetry without an overt emphasis on prosody. Don't chop your stuff into separate iambs. Don't make each line stop dead at the end and then begin every next line with a heave. Let the beginning of the next line catch the rise of the rhythm wave unless you want a definite longish pause. In short, behave as a musician, a good musician when dealing with that phase of your art which has exact parallels in music. Accordingly, poetry of this era is not studied the way you would study Romantic or Victorian poetry, by unpacking the excesses of style and substance and admiring the excesses and then putting them all together to marvel at an extraordinary work product. Most of imagist and symbolist poetry is best read and experienced by an intense brainstorming over what purpose the image serves, its context, and the sheer choice of words given that there's such little room. And in that, I suppose it also gives the reader reasonable freedom to take the poem for a spin, see what they can make of it. In due course, the verse vault will migrate out of 1800s London and find its way to imagist poetry, but in the meanwhile, here are a few poems I think would make great reading. Sea Rose by H.D., which is an unsettling description of what appears to be a particularly acrimonious and unpleasant rose. In a Station of the Metro by Ezra Pound, which is literally all of 2 lines. A City Sunset by T.E. Hume, supposedly the earliest testaments to the principles of imagism. As a final word, the following passage is an extract from UNESCO's page on World Poetry Day. UNESCO first adopted 21 March as World Poetry Day during its 30th General Conference in Paris in 1999, with the aim of supporting linguistic diversity through poetic expression and increasing the opportunity for endangered languages to be heard. World Poetry Day is the occasion to honor poets, revive oral traditions of poetry recitals, promote the reading, writing, and teaching of poetry, and foster the convergence between poetry and other arts such as theatre, dance, music, and painting, and raise the visibility of poetry in the media. And so, while the occasion is an excellent excuse to sit around and talk about the joys of poetry in the English language, in a world where international borders continue to blur between customs and cultures, languages and beliefs, the creation of a harmonious and accommodative collective consciousness is incredibly important, and I cannot think of a better way for the masses to achieve that than to read and appreciate poetry in native and regional languages.